Oskar Dirlewanger was one of the most infamous figures in the history of Nazi Germany. He was born in 1895 in Würzburg, Germany, and grew up in a middle-class family. Like many men of his generation, his life was shaped by the First World War. He joined the German army in 1913, and when the war broke out, he served as a machine gun officer on the Western Front. He was wounded several times and received medals for bravery. After the war, Germany was left in chaos, and Dirlewanger, like many veterans, struggled to find a place in civilian life. He joined a group of right-wing paramilitaries known as the Freikorps, which fought against communist uprisings and took part in violent clashes during the unstable years of the Weimar Republic. In the 1920s, Dirlewanger studied political science at university and eventually earned a doctorate, but his reputation was already darkened by violent tendencies and a fondness for drinking. Despite his education, he was not well suited for normal civilian life. He joined the Nazi Party early, in the 1920s, and saw it as a movement that would restore Germany's power and order. However, his personal life soon spiraled out of control. In 1934, he was convicted of a sexual offense involving a minor, which led to his imprisonment and expulsion from the party. For most people, that would have been the end of any military or political career, but the chaos of the Nazi system and Dirlewanger's connections allowed him to reappear later in one of the regime's most brutal roles. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Dirlewanger found a way to rebuild his status. He volunteered to fight with Franco's nationalist forces, joining other Germans who were unofficially supported by the Nazi regime. In Spain, he gained a reputation for both recklessness and cruelty, but he also proved himself as a capable soldier in irregular warfare. When he returned to Germany after the war, he used his connection to Gottlob Berger, a senior SS officer and one of his old comrades, to gain acceptance back into the Nazi system. It was Berger who would later sponsor Dirlewanger's rise and help him form a special military unit that became notorious for its violence. At the start of the Second World War, the Nazi leadership needed men willing to fight brutal counterinsurgency campaigns, especially in occupied territories. In 1940, Dirlewanger was put in charge of a special SS unit made up of convicted poachers. The idea was that these men were skilled in tracking, survival, and hunting, qualities that might help in fighting partisans. The unit was called the Wilddieb Kommando, or the Poachers Unit. It was officially part of the SS and under the control of Himmler. At first, it operated in Poland, where German forces were already carrying out mass killings and terror campaigns against the local population. Dirlewanger's unit quickly gained a reputation for extreme cruelty, even by Nazi standards. Dirlewanger believed in total war and saw civilians, including women and children, as potential enemies. His men looted, burned villages, and executed prisoners without hesitation. Reports of their behavior spread, and even within the SS, some officers were horrified. But instead of being punished, Dirlewanger's unit was expanded. Himmler and Berger saw him as useful because he was willing to do the kind of work others hesitated to do: the extermination of resistance movements and terrorizing of civilian populations. Over time, the unit grew to include not just poachers but also other criminals, including murderers and rapists. It became a dumping ground for men who were too violent or unstable for regular military service. Under Dirlewanger's command, these convicts were turned loose on occupied territories, and their actions caused devastation wherever they went. By 1942, the unit, now called the SS Sturm Brigade Dirlewanger, was sent to the occupied Soviet territories, particularly in Belarus, where partisan resistance was strong. Nazi policies there were already genocidal, but Dirlewanger's men added a new level of brutality. They burned entire villages to the ground, massacred thousands of civilians, and took part in the mass killing of Jews. They often staged fake battles to justify the killing of non-combatants, reporting inflated numbers of partisans killed. Survivors told of horrifying acts: people being tortured, burned alive, or used for target practice. The atrocities were so extreme that even some German officers complained to their superiors, warning that Dirlewanger's methods were damaging discipline and morale. But the Nazi hierarchy continued to protect him. Dirlewanger himself was a man consumed by sadism and alcoholism. He was known to take part personally in the torture and killing of prisoners. He seemed to enjoy inflicting pain and chaos. Some accounts describe him as unstable, often drunk in battle, leading his men in fits of violent rage. Yet he continued to receive promotions and decorations, partly because his campaigns produced results in terms of destroyed villages and dead resistance fighters. His actions fit the Nazi policy of collective punishment, which viewed entire populations as guilty if partisans were active nearby. For the leadership, the terror he spread was not a problem, but a tool. In 1943 and 1944, Dirlewanger's unit was moved to Poland, where the situation was growing increasingly unstable as the Red Army approached from the east and resistance movements intensified. It was in Warsaw, during the uprising of 1944, that Dirlewanger and his men carried out some of their worst crimes. The Warsaw Uprising began when Polish resistance forces attempted to liberate the city from German control before the Soviets arrived. Hitler ordered that the city be destroyed and its inhabitants exterminated. Dirlewanger's brigade was brought in as part of the force to crush the uprising. Over the course of the fighting, Dirlewanger's men committed mass killings on an enormous scale. In the Wola district of Warsaw, they slaughtered tens of thousands of civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Victims were shot, burned, or beaten to death. Entire hospitals were set on fire with patients inside. The unit's violence was so extreme that even some regular German officers and police units were sickened by it. But Dirlewanger was praised by Himmler for his effectiveness. The massacre of Wola became one of the single worst atrocities committed by Nazi forces during the war. After the destruction of Warsaw, Dirlewanger's brigade continued its campaign of terror in other parts of Poland and Slovakia, fighting both resistance fighters and advancing Allied forces. By late 1944, it had been formally upgraded to a division, though it never reached the strength or organization of a true military division. It was largely composed of criminals, concentration camp inmates, and foreign collaborators forced into service. The unit suffered enormous casualties, both in combat and through internal violence. Dirlewanger himself was repeatedly wounded, but always returned to command. His reputation as a sadist only grew, and he remained protected by Berger's influence within the SS. As Germany's situation deteriorated in 1945, the Dirlewanger unit was thrown into desperate defensive battles against the advancing Red Army. It was poorly equipped and poorly led, but its brutality did not diminish. In the final months of the war, it operated in Central Europe, including Slovakia and Hungary, suppressing uprisings and carrying out reprisal killings. By then, the unit had lost much of its original strength, and many of its men deserted or were killed. Dirlewanger himself was badly wounded again in early 1945. Despite his injuries, he continued to lead what remained of his force until the final collapse of Nazi Germany. When the war ended, Dirlewanger tried to escape capture by disguising himself as an ordinary soldier. He was eventually caught in June 1945 in Germany by Allied forces. He was imprisoned in the town of Altshausen, where he was recognized by Polish soldiers serving with the French army. Within days of his arrest, he was beaten to death in custody. Some accounts say Polish guards were responsible, taking revenge for his crimes in Warsaw. His death was a brutal end for a man who had inflicted so much suffering on others. There was never a trial, but his record was already known. Even within the SS, his name had become synonymous with depravity. Oskar Dirlewanger remains one of the darkest figures in the history of the Second World War. His unit's actions were so extreme that they stood out even among the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. Historians have struggled to find words to describe the level of cruelty his men inflicted. His career shows how the Nazi system rewarded not only obedience but also sadism, as long as it served the regime's goals. He embodied the worst aspects of the SS, its fanaticism, its racism, and its total disregard for human life. Dirlewanger's story also shows how chaos and corruption worked within the Nazi power structure. He should have been cast out after his criminal conviction in the 1930s, but personal connections and the demands of war allowed him to return. His sponsor, Gottlob Berger, used him as a tool for dirty work that others would not do. Himmler's approval meant that no matter how many complaints were filed, Dirlewanger could continue. In this way, his rise and survival reflected the moral collapse of the entire regime. After the war, the Dirlewanger Brigade became a symbol of pure criminality, disguised as military service. It showed how easily ordinary men, when organized around brutality and hate, could commit unimaginable crimes. The unit's records were used as evidence in post-war trials, and survivors of the areas they ravaged testified about their crimes. In many villages in Belarus and Poland, the memory of Dirlewanger's men lived on for generations as a name associated with terror and destruction. In recent years, historians have tried to understand how a man like Dirlewanger could rise so far within the SS. Some see him as a product of the violence of his times, a soldier from the First World War who never adapted to peace, who found his purpose only in chaos and destruction. Others view him as a sadistic criminal who thrived in a system that rewarded cruelty. Either way, his life is a warning about what happens when a society embraces brutality as policy. Dirlewanger's story is not just about one man's evil. It is about a regime that allowed and even encouraged such evil to flourish. Thanks for watching. If you have a thought on Oskar Dirlewanger, drop it in a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe.